You're listening to Climate Champions, a podcast from the Architects Journal. I'm Hattie Hartman, Sustainability Editor at the Architects Journal.
And I'm Hattie's co-host, Rachael Owens. I'm co-director at the National Retrofit Hub and Head of Sustainability at Buckley Gray Yeoman.
For every project, we sort of start with a site and kind of a map, like looking at where it is geographically, and then we look at the landscape around it. It tends to be a sort of sweeping glance at the landscape and an estimation really of what materials or products are potentially being produced there or might be produced there. I think with working in the UK, we tend to be imagining a future rather than working within the present, in as much as we might be speculating on the potential for woodlands to produce certain materials, even though today we import them from mainland Europe.
Our guest today is Summer Islam, a founding director of Material Cultures, a design and research consultancy that is pioneering greater use of biobased materials in construction and bioregional material sourcing. The practice's main message, outlined in its provocative short book, Material Reform, is that our extractive construction industry needs a radical overhaul. Through built projects, research, teaching, films, and hands-on workshops, Material Cultures is leading the way in demonstrating that it's possible to build differently. Just 6 years old and with 27,000 Instagram followers, Material Cultures has emerged as a serious disruptor of business as usual in the UK and beyond, teaching at ETH in Zurich and the recent recipient of 2 international awards, Rice University's Spotlight Award in Houston, Texas, and the Architectural Review's Peter Davey Prize for Emerging Practitioners. Prior to co-founding Material Cultures with Paloma Gormley and George Masoud, Summer worked at 6A and Caruso St. John. She is currently pursuing a PhD in the Riot Lab at EPFL in Lausanne, Switzerland. Today, we're talking to Summer about what motivated her to found Material Cultures, how her portfolio approach enriches her work, and what's currently top of mind for her. We'll hear about her work in Birmingham with Civic Square, looking at community-led retrofit of a terrace street and a proposed neighborhood microfactory, what it's like teaching in Switzerland, as well as Material Culture's latest report, Building Skills, a materials strategy for Birmingham and the West Midlands. Summer, thanks for coming on the podcast. It's great to have you with us today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Hattie.
I'd like to start by asking you why you got fed up working in mainstream practice and what led you to set up Material Cultures.
I don't know if I was fed up. Maybe I was fed up. We were really excited to work together as friends. I think we felt like things could operate in a different way. And I think we also wanted all to have more direct relationship with the process of building. In my own experience, I found working on a construction project incredibly litigious and so frustrating in how confrontational the relationship is with a contractor. And that was really kind of, for me, one of the driving forces behind wanting to work in a different way and wanting to be more directly involved on building projects. I like working on construction projects myself when I have the choice. Broadly speaking, we maybe get to do that less often than we imagined, I think.
That's really interesting. I totally agree with you about the litigious nature of managing a project. But let's start a bit with the big picture. So how do you go about researching and selecting materials for use in a specific context or a region? Where do you start?
Generally now we have established a reasonably consistent methodology, and for every project we sort of start with a site and kind of a map, like looking at where it is geographically, and then we look at the landscape around it, and how far we cast that net depends a little bit on probably the kind of ecological and economic circumstances that region is in. But it tends to be a sort of sweeping glance at the landscape and an estimation really of what materials or products are potentially being produced there or might be produced there. I think with working in the UK, we tend to be imagining a future rather than working within the present, in as much as we might be speculating on the potential for woodlands to produce certain materials, even though today we import them from mainland Europe. So that tends to be the starting point. And then at this point now, we've done that a few times. So there's a sort of maybe a data bank of materials to go to and to sort of cross-reference against landscapes. That's the beginning.
Nice. So you've released 3 short films on extraction, timber and straw, and last year you did one on sand, which was accompanied by an exhibition at St Gallen in Switzerland. The issues around sand supply chains really exemplify why your approach is so important. And a couple of years ago I interviewed Kieran Pereira, who's the author of Sand Stories, and ever since I've been really fascinated about all the multiple impacts of this like completely ubiquitous material. I wondered if you could talk a bit about what the use and extraction of sand tell us about our cultural reliance on extractive process, and also like why films and what are you intending to sort of convey with those?
I think for us, the provocation to be exploring sand in this research project, which we did also with a PhD collaborator called Emma Rachael, was to think about materials that we rely on that are incredibly extractive and mineral based that we can't do without. So that was a starting point, was to sort of maybe look internally at the processes we take for granted in the practice, and to list out all the materials that we can't really find substitutes for in plant-based or regenerative alternatives, and to sort of follow along each of those products the source of the silica that we use, or that is extracted to make those products that we use to make silicone sealants or glass in our windows or lime in our plasters and all these different things. So that was the beginning. And I think what was particularly exciting for us was to follow not just the process of the product being made and the sand being extracted, but also to look at the quarry as an ecology, think about what there used to be on the land where sand is being quarried today, what ecology could take over that land in the future. So it became a kind of speculative project, really thinking about the habitats that used to exist in the case of the quarry we particularly studied in the exhibition, what was, I think, most recently farmland, but was probably historically woodland, looking forward at what that sand quarry can host in terms of different ecologies. And the question really for us was what the ecological value of the land in the future could be, understanding that it's the ecologies that we have lost in the process of extracting sand, but that there's a potential for those landscapes to have value in the future. There isn't really an alternative right now other than reducing use. But we did want to sort of put forward the question that there are landscapes that we extract from that we don't see because they're hidden from us.
Yeah, I think that really links to something I've been reading in George Monbiot's book, Feral, where actually there's a shifting relationship with the land, and maybe it's not about trying to go back to exactly what the land was before, but thinking about what a productive and really healthy and diverse ecosystem can look like from the context of what we've got. And I think that's a really exciting thing that you're doing in that space.
I think for us it's such an important question because we have got used to taking so many things for granted, and even in the quite narrow bandwidth of materials that we work with in material cultures, there are lots of things that we are still very complicit in, and lots of forms of extraction that we rely on to produce buildings in the way that we do. And I think just being constantly reminded really of that and of the consequences is really important, and not to be sort of casting, criticism on all of our fellow practitioners or people who rely on these products and use have windows in their homes or use devices that rely on silicate chips and things like that, but just to make it a question that there and to foreground again, I think, and in all of our work this is a really central principle, but we don't see materials being extracted anymore, mostly.
Absolutely.
And our landscape doesn't really appear very productive. Understandably it's full of agriculture, but actually what it might once have looked like is very different, and our relationship to those forms of processing and extraction and production is very different today. And so a lot of what we're exploring in the film about sand and in our other films that we did about straw and timber is really just the question of what it would mean to live in a landscape which is one we're both trying to actively care for and regenerate, but also one which is being cultivated productively, and rather than having those two things in conflict, try and find a way of bringing them together, which is a very difficult thing. We're a very small island. Lots of people live on it. But it's a question.
So another thing you've been doing is leading lots of hands-on workshops with a variety of natural and bio-based materials. So why do you think these workshops are an important way of getting your message across and increasing the use of natural materials? And maybe you could tell us about some of your most enjoyable collaborations that you've had.
The workshops have become so important to the work that we do, and they are the way that we share what we have learned and also the way that we learn more. So it's a kind of joy and a privilege to do them, to be honest. They're tiring, but they're also really wonderful experiences. And they're central because I think we have, as an organisation, been trying to work on all the different fronts that we find obstacles on to furthering the work of regenerative construction. And one of the central obstacles we find as architects, we still practice predominantly as architects, is that there aren't the skills that we seek on construction sites to deliver the buildings that we have designed. It's not that they are non-existent, but they are rare, and they are therefore it's hard to find the people who have those skills. It's hard to book them. They have long lead times. Sometimes that work gets priced more expensively than is justified by a main contractor who doesn't understand that work, and maybe has never worked with lime or doesn't know wood fibre insulation, or these are quite mainstream things as we would see them. And so there was an idea that, actually working to further knowledge and skill for builders and contractors was a really productive thing to do for us as well as an organisation. But I also think actually that as the workshops have evolved, we've been teaching a much broader pool of people. And one of the more central maybe audiences for these workshops now are communities who are gathering together to take action themselves to improve the buildings that they live and work with, and that sharing what we know about materials which are quite easy to work with. Those skills can be in some cases very accessible, and as a community they can collaboratively repair a building with those skills. That's really an empowering thing for them, and it's a really joyful thing for us to be involved in. Civic Square are a community-based organisation in Birmingham, and we've been working with them to run a programme of workshops over the last year called Material Matters, and now a subsequent programme of workshops called Rebuilders. And in that relationship, we have been, exposed to and opened up to teaching and working with community organisations from across the country. And that has been really joyful. Their approach was to ask us to run a programme of workshops that upskilled their residential community in the kind of ecosystem of people around them. But they also invited people from right across the country with the ambition that then that knowledge then gets kind of taken back to the Highlands and then the Southwest, and it's gone everywhere. It just felt like suddenly there was much more exponential impact to those workshops, which was really exciting.
That's really interesting. You seem to have a very collaborative way of working. So tell us a little bit about how you and Paloma and George work, and if you have others working with you now, or you collaborate as and when. How do you approach your work?
We love collaborating in different ways. I think it's brings us joy. We're not just the three of us anymore. We are a team, a fantastic team, without whom we could not do any of the work that we do. We sort of wax and wane between about 8 and 12 people at the moment, with some people working part-time and quite flexibly. And we tend to discuss together as the group every Monday morning when new work comes in, how it might be approached. We also have a process actually now where we have a kind of matrix, or a decision-making matrix, by which we decide whether or not we will take on that work. So collectively we run through kind of our organisation's values and whether or not the work aligns with them and whether or not anyone's interested in running the work.
Let's get into some detail now. So you've selected 3 materials for the retrofit of a typical wall in a commercial building: hempcrete, wood fibre and straw. For many working in the commercial sphere, these will be quite unfamiliar materials. Why these materials, and how do you intend to use them in the projects where you've identified them for?
The choice of those materials has been at the end of a process of distilling from research projects that maybe one after another have found similar findings about the accessibility of certain materials, their ability to scale in the British climate and industry, and maybe how widely understood they are. And those 3 materials are relatively well known, say relatively, and we're particularly interested in our work advocating specifically a bio-based palette where we can. So they're all plant-based materials, They're regenerative. They come from reasonably short rotation plants that can then be regrown, and that's quite important. And they also sit within a British landscape, so we can map a region, we can talk about a place, and we can look out the window at the fields and at the forests and articulate how those materials could be grown and the benefit of that to the ecosystems locally. So there's a kind of a broader strategic reason for some of those choices, but also in a kind of practical day-to-day application of those materials. We know that they work quite well in both new build and retrofit applications. There are different ways of working, for example, with hempcrete, like you can cast it in situ and shutter, but equally you can buy a block product or make block products. I guess with each of them, maybe with the exception of something like wood fibre, there's the capacity for communities to actually kind of fabricate as well as there is for them to install. And I think that's a particularly empowering thing when you're teaching and working with an organisation that might want to retrofit a building. Straw, I think, is the ultimate equitable material because everyone can pick up a bale and build with straw, and it's incredibly empowering when you realise that within half a day you can put up a whole wall. Obviously, there's lots of guidance and particular understanding of how you do that, which is really important, not to devalue, but at the same time, it is something people can do together, and they can buy the bales and they can build. So I think there's kind of different factors, for each of those materials, why we sort of settle on them. Straw is the leveller, but at the same time, wood fibre brings you really close to existing building systems and practices. So when you're talking to a builder on site, if you end up, wanting to work with one, it's not very different really from a bat installation they might have worked with in other places. So you're given a selection of options, maybe in that short list of 3, where depending on how you procure the project, there's always a way forward.
Yeah, I really like that idea that you're enabling existing supply chains, existing builders in the space to be able to work with you alongside you on these projects, and at the same time you're growing the amount of people that can construct as well. So it's this sort of balance between business as usual made much better and then sort of much more sort of democratic systems.
So, Summer, you recently exhibited some innovative sheet materials from UK timber supply chains at the Victoria and Albert. Are there any plans to take that work forward? Tell us a little about that.
So the project was called Woodland Goods, and we produced research specifically for the Woodland Goods plinth, which is in the Furniture Gallery at the V&A, and it's currently still being exhibited until the last quarter of this year. The research question for the work was what materials and products might you be able to draw from woodlands which are regeneratively managed beyond timber. So thinking about materials that aren't explicitly the kind of trunk of the tree and the way that we think about how you cut down a tree, strip the bark off, plane off all the edges and end up with this kind of perfect product. What are the things that we might once have extracted from woodlands in a different model of management, also in a different model of ownership, where we used to have access to common lands and common woodlands where people could go and take firewood and forage mushrooms, and different income streams came from that kind of landscape typology, which we sort of don't have anymore. Most of our woodlands are privately owned today. So that was the kind of research question, and then actually where we ended up focusing our time was really on the skin of the tree, actually on the kind of bark and the saps and the resin, so the kind of natural binders and the bark of the tree. What we produced were a series of sheet materials bound with heat as much as possible, kind of heat pressed. So trying to make sheet materials that didn't rely on the glues and chemicals that end up in plywood and OSB, and ultimately also in the waterways when those materials have degraded. And some of the materials were also bound with natural resins or biobased resins. But the reason that bark was an interesting question for us is because today it is mostly chipped. So the idea of even taking those products further in innovation and testing and the kind of traditional route that you have in market development in the UK now necessitates a completely different supply chain in the sawmills that we have in the UK, because actually they're not set up currently to peel barks, they're set up to strip them. And so you need a quite different infrastructure to facilitate those materials being put forward. But they felt like really interesting alternatives and really interesting substitutes, I guess, for some of the OSBs and chipboards that we've become really dependent on.
And we know some of your students recently completed Clearfell House, a demonstrator project in the Dalby Forest in Yorkshire, built from local larch and ash. I wondered, what are the main takeaways from that project?
Oh, there were so many. We learnt about all the different forms of woodland management and kind of cultivation. They were incredibly generous, the team at Forestry England, so they gave us a guided tour of the continuous cover models and the strip felling and clear felling sites and the kind of forest gardens at Dalby. It really opened our eyes, I think, to the labour of woodland cultivation, the complexity of changing models from monoculture systems to continuous cover. Also the value of those changes, but the work of cutting trees down and surveying them and moving them around and how you shift from one model to another is really labour intensive and very slow work. So it was really informative and kind of, I guess, has changed the way we think about timber in the office.
I had an incredible trip about 18 months ago with AHEC, the American Hardwood Export Forest, to northwestern Pennsylvania. And it was the same thing in the Allegheny Forest. They were really trying to shift the way they do things. And one of the biggest problems they have there is the deer, that when you're trying to grow new saplings, you have to protect that area until the saplings are established and keep the deer out. And, then you get into plastic fencing, and they were trying to work out natural barriers that, taking you take down all the branches and things that don't go to the sawmill and make a natural barrier.
Yeah, it's exactly the same here, I think. We had lots of conversations about deer, also squirrels, and the challenges. You can see how the shift in one piece of land somewhere has completely affected the parcel of land, tens of miles away. And obviously the proliferation of deer across the countryside is a real issue for woodland creation and regeneration. It's a real problem.
And you mentioned earlier that you'd been collaborating with Civic Square in Birmingham, and I wondered if you could tell us a bit about the skills for transition learning journey that you've sort of taken together over the last several months. We understand that part of this 6-month course for builders on the route to regenerative construction, and that's ongoing at the moment. This is so needed, and you've already mentioned that a lot of this is about bringing more people with the skills to be able to deliver the types of materiality and the types of constructions you're specifying, but also to engage the community. I wondered, could you tell us a little bit about how it's going and what's next?
Yeah, it's going really well. It's been an incredible project. Civic Square and Dark Matter Labs have been kind of leading on the kind of curation of the programme, and then as Material Cultures, we've been working with them on practical demonstration and skills days where the cohort come together and learn about hempcrete, clay plastering, wood fibre insulation. I think the project is really, as you say, it's kind of critical model, and I think we'd love to be able to repeat it and grow this sort of teaching. It's been really exciting to talk directly to builders who are interested in a different way of working and are, I think, then exposed to and kind of get to see different building sites and meet different material manufacturers and natural builders. And I think what we've been really focusing on in the practical days is accessible skills, skills that are really easy to pick up, or products which are quite well regulated and certified on the market, and just sort of showing how simple a substitution can be in some of the applications that they have in construction projects. And I think we've been really inspired by meeting all the different people on the course, and would love to have opportunities to run this sort of thing again and develop the programme.
Through the book that you did, are you starting to reflect on how this can have a bigger impact, say at a regional scale or a national scale, this work that you're doing?
Impact has always been one of the driving forces in the work. We change all the time, maybe our understanding of where that impact sits. I think our early ambitions to be producing house designs and working with house builders have sort of sat nurtured in the background, never fully centred. And I think now where we see our impact has slightly changed, through these courses and through the work of the book and other things like that. But we would love to be able to work in house design and housing design and larger scale building projects. We want to be involved in showing what's possible. And now we're looking at what levers we need to pull to make that change and how we engage with development and find the capital that's necessary to support communities to build the housing that they need.
I think the work you do really does help to change mindsets in practice, because you can see the live examples of these materials being used in the UK. And I think another way you're having a lot of impact is through the sort of knowledge and the research that you're generating. And at the end of 2024, you released a building skills report, which was a bioregional mapping of construction resources and material opportunities, specifically in Birmingham and the West Midlands. And that was to establish a framework for the work you're doing with Civic Square in the Ladywood neighbourhood of Birmingham. So I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about that. How did you approach that work, and what were some of the highlights from what you found?
So building skills was quite extensive research project for us, and similar in some of its methodology to some work we've done before in the UK, in Yorkshire and in Newham and in the southwest, but more particularly focused on the ecosystem of potential collaborators, specifically for our client, for Civic Square, the community organisation who are based in Ladywood that we've been working with. We approach these projects in as comprehensive a way as we can. I think we love being able to get a really in-depth understanding of the place. So I mentioned earlier the way that we sort of start out mapping and looking at what the landscape has in it. And then there's a quite slow process, really, of trying to find people who farm and who forest and who are working directly with materials that we might want to use in building projects. There isn't really a comprehensive list, or if there is, I'd love someone please to send it to me, of mills that are active of different scales, or of farmers who might be growing wheat who would bale the straw for us to use. And actually, we find that a lot of that work is just ringing around, or going to meet some people who are foresters and talk to them about where they sell that timber, and can they give us a list of people who might buy it, and who are the mills that they know locally that they work with. And then we visit those mills and see what timbers they have in stock and ask them about their capacity to supply building projects. And often we find people who are really excited and really interested to collaborate, but like, oh, we've not really done buildings recently, it's been fence posts. Or also the connections that we make through going to see people, so we sort of drive around, or if we can, we cycle, build relationships that then we can sort of pass to our clients and say, there's a really great small scale mill down the road run by a family. They've got these beautiful timbers. They might be a good partner. It's also a question of starting to build a network, because we might, for a scale of project that Civic Square looked to undertake, they would need maybe a number of mills or a number of farmers. So then we start to build a picture of potential people they could work with in a sort of more holistic way across the landscape. And then there's also like a process of interviewing people and really understanding as much as we can how they work and how they might be part of a kind of broader ecosystem or kind of material supply chain, and then sharing that knowledge, because it takes us a long time to find it, and we're very privileged to get to do that. And then, one of the central principles for our work is always that the reports then are Creative Commons licensed, so they can go online and other people can download the information and hopefully build on it.
So does that build a kind of internal momentum once you get a critical mass, or?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess we get excited by those relationships, and we, especially the pairing with in the work with Civic Square of the research with the courses.
So there's a way to channel
and with the
it.
design. Yeah, it meant that actually it was really amplified. So we found, for example, there's a really great social enterprise called Jericho based in Birmingham, and they have one of their kind of arms of work is this organisation called Wood Shack that work with reclaimed timber supply chains. They sell timber that's come from building sites and like been used before. They also train people who particularly need skills to find work. So it's a really extraordinary social enterprise project. And then in finding them, we were able to list them as a potential supplier of timber for the project, but also invite them to run workshops for material matters, because that's one of the things that they have as a central skill, is teaching people how to work with timber, which has been used before. They've been actually a really important partner through the whole project.
So one of the things that interested me your building skills report is the material matrix that you've developed. So you've taken all this inventory and you've tried to create a framework of how to structure it in a accessible and easy to use way. So explain that a little bit if you could.
So the material matrix is a tool, or it's intended to function as a tool. At the moment it exists in the report, but actually we're working with Civic Square also to turn it into a digital tool, which will be on a website. And the idea is it's something to help community clients, domestic clients, anyone who's interested in some building work and would like some support making choices around the materials that they would use in the project. And we worked to try and make our knowledge of these materials as accessible as possible, to make it easy to start comparing a particular material based on certain priorities that come up for us time and again. And they are cost and embodied carbon and distance of the material from site. So where it's being produced. Just look at, well, that one might cost more, but is made really close by and potentially has lower embodied carbon.
It's such a dramatic change to business as usual, where you're picking things out of a catalog that might travel across the world. And the fact that you're able to actually, identify, however many, a dozen or materials, and then know exactly where they're coming from and be able to assess them in that way. I mean, this is the way things need to move, but it certainly seems so far from the way things happened.
I'm sure it's moving that way. It's just, it is still surprising to us. So we have to sit down and find the address of the factory and put it on a map. I mean, because it would seem obvious to us that you would share that information. But I understand lots of manufacturers are actually quite cagey these days about wanting to share information, because where they're doing their best in some way and maybe in decarbonising some element of their production, there are certain things about where their factories are based they can't change. And I think they can be quite defensive.
Actually, all of the ethical considerations that actually being able to source locally makes you so much more aware of, and the fact that the supply chain is completely, almost transparently laid out, whereas on so many products that we specify, we have no idea who's been involved in the extraction and production of these materials and how they've been treated. So I think there's a massive opportunity there as well in the work that you're doing to really rethink how the sort of beyond the carbon and beyond the sort of environmental impacts of our material use can be sort of made better by knowing where these supply chains come from.
It's become really central to how we think about material choice, actually. So obviously embodied carbon is really important, but there are other factors that aren't included. I mean, that's what we were really looking at with the sand exhibition. We didn't look at the embodied carbon so much of the materials, but we did try and understand what kind of sand certain products were made from and where that sand was being extracted and what precious habitat had been there beforehand. And they're all different because all the sands come from different landscapes and sit underneath different ecosystems mostly. And with the matrix, originally we had a fourth line actually, which was biodiversity impact. And it's almost impossible to find any information. It was a kind of ambition for the project. If anyone has any leads, we'd love a collaborator to help us do that work, because it feels like a really important metric. I think it's Expedition Engineering who've already done a really interesting report on biodiversity impact for structural materials. We'd love to take it further and look at the kind of products that we use in building out wall build-ups and floors and roofs and things like that. But it is really difficult to find some of that information. I think we really patronise a lot of domestic and community clients in this country. I think there's an assumption that people don't need to know information and don't really want it. And our experience is that people are incredibly interested and conscientious and want to make choices that align with their values and just aren't informed because we deliberately obscure, as an industry, the impact of certain processes and materials. And I think if confronted with choices about social value and carbon and biodiversity impact, as well as cost, they will make the choice that they can sit most comfortably with.
I absolutely agree with you that we do infantilise people and really underestimate the engagement that lots of people have with this. Actually being able to provide that information in a way that's really clear is game changing. I wondered as well if you could paint us a bit of a picture about what's going on in Ladywood at the moment. What's going on right now?
So Ladywood is a residential neighbourhood, and there is within the neighbourhood a really quite substantial site which was historically a waste sorting depot, early 20th century, huge industrial building, which has had kind of various uses over its lifetime, but it's now looking to be acquired by the community from the freeholder to make a public square, a kind of extraordinary community resource and piece of infrastructure. And we've been working with them on exploring part of the retrofit of that site and engaging with the community as a whole through the workshops that we've been running, which are the Material Matters workshops, and also a few other ones that were done over the summer to be more accessible to families.
Tell us more about the plans for this depot that you're developing.
The overall design for the site has been done by Architecture 00. So we've been working with Civic Square on a part of it, which is called the microfactory, which is actually a kind of makerspace or a place in which maybe some of the work that we do with Material Matters, for example, could have been hosted. So a place where you could run courses on natural building skills, a place where you might go to learn about how to retrofit your own home, a site where you might even be able to run material fabrication, processing lines for certain kinds of things for the community to then use themselves in their own retrofit. It's a microfactory, it's a hub for fabrication and learning. And we've been working on the development of the retrofit of that part of the site with Civic Square, and also in partnership with a EU-funded research project that we are part of the consortium for, called Inbuilt. And Inbuilt is a Horizon research project in which, as Material Cultures, we are running one of the 3 demonstrator sites across Europe, and it will be the microfactory at Civic Square. And in that project, we will be installing 3 innovative biobased materials that are kind of new to the market. One of them is a mycelium insulation board. The other one is a partition system made from waste wood. And the third is a recycled textile insulation bat. We hope, working with Civic Square now, to take the matrix and use that as a tool to co-design the retrofit of the microfactory and make choices together collaboratively about how the space will be designed, and then potentially also run workshops through which the community can be actively involved directly in retrofitting the building themselves.
If you're enjoying AJ Climate Champions, please like, follow, or leave us a short review. This helps others find us and means we can continue sharing voices from built environment climate activists who are leading the way. Your support is really appreciated. Now back to the show.
So let's talk a little bit more broadly about retrofit. You're obviously exploring opportunities of retrofit far beyond energy efficiency, as we've been talking about. And I wondered, where do you see the potential of well-selected bio-based materials to help ensure that retrofit is regenerative by design? Is this something that you feel like we should be adopting on much more of the retrofit that we're doing, and what are the benefits?
Yeah, I mean, definitely we think we should be adopting lots of bio-based materials in retrofit projects. And I think there is loads of potential. I think for us it's really important to, as much as we can, try and centre, building reuse and kind of not building anew. All the knowledge we've accrued so far on these materials is applied so well to building retrofit, and ultimately actually a lot of the knowledge that we work with has come from a sort of heritage and conservation industry, that sort of started working these materials first because they made the most sense for historic buildings. I think there's quite a lot of work to do still on how we balance regenerative materials with kind of floor plan efficiency and thinking more holistically about the house or the building as a whole, as a system, rather than just as a kind of thermal envelope. And I think one of the projects we're looking forward to exploring with Civic Square this year is a kind of street retrofit, looking specifically at individual residents' needs. And actually, is the answer always more insulation, or sometimes maybe the answer is an awning or a different garden design which provides solar shading, or a rearrangement of the plan? I think not to underestimate the value of insulation, but there's also a balance sometimes between what you can afford and what you need, and and maybe where the most impact can be had. I think the push towards insulating homes is important, but is, like with the embodied carbon metric, a very narrow way of thinking about how buildings could be retrofitted and what the impact of that would be. I've been doing research on my own as part of my PhD, looking at natural materials and retrofit, specifically looking at straw, and starting to try and understand maybe the wider impact of us using lots of materials very quickly to retrofit all the homes we need to retrofit. Kind of really exploring the thread of scaling that question, whether or not you do it with a polyurethane insulation or a straw-based one, still starting to question what the impact is of really doing anything at large. I'm personally really interested in is when people come to accept something is good, then I start to wonder how good it is or what it is to use something that's, in one scenario objectively beneficial when it's used at large. I haven't come to the conclusion that straw at scale is a really bad thing, but it is dependent on really dominant monoculture wheat systems and the use of all sorts of fertilizers and pesticides. So nothing is so clear cut and simple as a good material and a bad material.
And once you start to scale up, the impacts change significantly. So maybe it's about balance. At the National Retrofit Hub, we've just started this quite exciting project with the BRE called Retro Net Zero, where we're looking at innovation in retrofit and how that can be better enabled by better pathways through regulation. So that should be quite an exciting thing to try and help some biobased innovation as well by thinking about how regulation can better support it.
Well, in a similar vein, this concept of scaling, but more on the commercial side or office side, you recently completed a fit out of a studio space in King's Cross using bio-based materials. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Are there elements there that you think can be scaled?
Yeah, absolutely. So the project was for a social enterprise called Fish Tank. It's a kind of workspace and a gallery space for kind of young entrepreneurs within the borough. And it was fitted out with regenerative materials. Actually, the nature of the project makes it very scalable. And in that, I mean particularly the procurement context. The freeholder of the building is the developer Argent. There are certain materials that they're comfortable with us using and certain materials that they weren't so comfortable with us using. And so actually, in a way, that process was a kind of quite back and forth iterative one, but ultimately where it's landed is with a set of materials which a developer, as they were project managing on the client side, was ultimately comfortable with. And so all of those choices are ones which we can imagine very easily being used at scale across, a large scale residential project or a huge public building, things like wood wall and wood wall boards and wood fibre insulation and, lime plasters, clay plasters. Those are things that are actually really quite palatable, to projects at scale. The wood wall boards are quite good at doing kind of internal lining because of their kind of fire resistance. The plasters equally are relatively well understood, and there are products which you can use for clay plasters which have the certification, and building control are comfortable with them. There's lots of advantages to those things in that they are quite scalable systems.
I wanted to sort of come back a little bit to your practice as well. And we know that you make this conscious effort to resist some of the extractive and harmful practices that are prevalent in the architecture and the built environment caused by overwork culture and top-down management. And you're really, really transparent. You share all your policies on your website via a Google Drive. And I wondered if you could tell us a bit about the decisions that you've had to make for your practice in that way and why that transparency is so important to you.
I think when we moved away from working for other companies and organisations and sat down to start our new endeavour together, we had lots of hope and ambition for it to operate differently. And whilst we were smaller, we were able to operate, between ourselves with kind of shared understanding as friends and collaborators and lots of trust. And when we grew, we wanted to continue to foster that culture as much as possible. And it's not to say we always succeed. And I'm sure there are lots of things you could talk to our team about that they would love to change. But we do our best to make regular opportunities for them to tell us. And I think actually a lot of our our approach to that and our learning about how to do that differently has really come from teaching and from running these projects, like these demonstrator projects on site, and from teaching studios, where first of all we learn how to teach better from our students demanding more of us, and we learn from making mistakes. Running projects which are really ambitious but tightly programmed and become really stressful because there's lots to do in a short space of time, and really understanding the impact that has on us and on our students and on our collaborators. And it's not good, and we don't really want to operate like that. I mean, for us as a small organisation, it feels like quite a lot of resource into designing these policies. They are constantly workshopped with the team who add comments and can make changes, and then we take the changes on board and then we publish them, and I'm sure they will continue to change. And we also have now quite open conversations with the team about our financial position and when we make changes to policies, what the impact is for us on cash flow. And it makes the work much more pleasurable when everyone is when everyone is as comfortable as we can afford. And I studied at a time when I think architectural culture in education and in the office was quite different. It was totally normal to work overtime and to not even ask for overtime pay and to just be lucky to have a job. And now our team and the people we teach are much more informed, much more articulate about their rights, and much more reasonable and emotionally intelligent about what is a good way of working. And actually, we are informed by them.
Before we wrap up, you've touched on your academic work, and I wanted to ask you a little bit more. So you were teaching, and I'm not sure if you still are. What can you share about your observations of how the system is different in terms of academia and training architects, and also the state of play with bio-based materials in Switzerland?
Well, yeah, we were teaching in Switzerland, sadly only for a semester. We ran a guest studio in the ETH in the autumn of 2023, which was a really extraordinary privilege and opportunity, and was a great kind of window into a different education system and a quite different procurement culture, also widely with architecture in general in the country. The students I moved to Switzerland for the time that we were teaching, partly because I was working my PhD, which is in Lausanne, and then I was able to be on the ground for the studio all the time, and Paloma and George came out to support me in the tutorials. So I developed a really close relationship with the students, and that was really, really nice to have the time and capacity to do that again. The education culture there and the industry more widely maybe doesn't know how good they have it. The quality of education at the ETH is very high. The resources available to students are really excellent. We were incredibly well resourced as a team. We were a teaching team of 5 people, a supporting group of 30. That is really beyond what we're used to experiencing in the UK. But I think generally it's an expensive country, Switzerland, and salaries accordingly are quite high for architects, and so teaching salaries. So there's one level of kind of privilege there, but at the same time, I think there is a real cultural value ascribed to architectural services, at least there, that we could really see in the way that public buildings are procured, the way that homes are designed. And we have become accustomed, I think, in the UK to an environment in which architectural services aren't actually really valued. And there's also a very different culture in Switzerland because they have a kind of competition culture in which, competitions where you might also be remunerated, shockingly, for your work. But there are many more opportunities for young practices to enter in building design for housing more than one unit and for public buildings, which are quite high profile. And that seems also to be quite exceptional. And for us was really shocking because our experience is generally, if we haven't done that kind of building before, we are almost closed out from accessing the opportunity to do it in the future. We haven't designed a school. It's unlikely that anyone will let us design one now, And then you go from being a young practice until you're in your 50s, and then suddenly you're too old. But it was a great opportunity to be teaching in Zurich. But we are also very glad, I think, now to be centering a lot more of our education work on the workshops, on the MAKE programme that we've established, and now on trying to found a construction school or a school where we would have a base and have more opportunities to offer different sorts of education opportunities.
Well, the industry is so siloed, in so many ways. And I think geographically it's also siloed. So this kind of cross-fertilization of ideas and what you can bring there and what you take away is just helps move the whole agenda forward. So tell us a little bit more about your PhD. You mentioned it briefly.
I am researching the impact of using straw insulation across construction projects at scale. And specifically, I'm focusing that work on retrofit, and the personal interest I have in both of those in the scaling is really thinking about biodiversity impact and the potential for the impact on kind of the skills industry. Maybe the central part of the project is to build 3 kind of experimental demonstrators that would be monitored and tested and compared.
So are these going to be built in the UK?
They were built in the UK.
Mm-hmm. And what led you to EPFL, to the Riot Lab?
I was led by my wonderful supervisor, Charlotte Morton-Bart, who we had collaborated with on a project as material cultures and developed a relationship with. It's been really game-changing for me, and I hope over time will also really support us doing a different kind of research work at the office.
You've got so many irons in the fire, and we haven't even touched on your role in the Phoenix Project in Lewis. Are you where you imagined you would be 6 years out?
I can't remember thinking forward. It was such a time in the present. It was really fun. I mean, we're still having quite a lot of fun, which is very nice. I think we imagined a different kind of organisation growing, and the one that we have now is better. I mean, we're constantly re-evaluating and sort of strategizing and spiraling. So I don't know where we'll be going either, but I think what we do is changing a little bit.
Can you share anything that's on the horizon for 2025 that we haven't covered that's in your pipeline?
We're really excited to be doing some more work with Civic Square this year on the retrofit of a street in Ladywood. We're also starting to run a few more courses in the summer, so keep an eye on our Instagram and our LinkedIn pages. We'll be pushing those out. And
where would you like to be in 10 years' time?
Oh, I'd really like to be outside.
In a forest somewhere?
Yeah, I'd take a field. I mean, we're working as much as we have capacity on trying to find somewhere to be based at where we can teach and build prototypes and be physically present. And I would like to be in one place outside in 10 years. That would be nice.
That is a good aspiration. I'm with you on that one.
Thank you so much, Summer, for sharing all this. It's fascinating what you're doing.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to Climate Champions, a podcast from the Architects Journal. After this episode, Climate Champions is taking a short break. If there are people you'd like to hear from in future episodes, do get in touch. Hattie.hartman@emap.com. That's Hattie.hartman@emap.com. Bye for now. Thanks to our producer, May Robson. Our theme music is Foro dos Dois Amigos by Edmilson do Pífano, interpreted by Felipe Tanaka e Banda Balaio de Baião. Don't forget to leave us a review and hit subscribe for new shows wherever you get your podcasts.